my point of departure is that in South Africa for the past 23 years, we've been fed a reformation disguised as transformation. And these are two different things. So in my view, reformation, basically, it's pretty much like a chameleon, basically that it changes colors depending on the environment that it finds itself. So reformation or reform will talk about the improvement, betterment, and correction. But it's not transformation. It's a reform. So transformation, it's in my view, it's like a metamorphosis, whereby a caterpillar moves or develops into become a pupa, and then from there it moves into becoming a butterfly. And when you look at the end state, the butterfly and the caterpillar, two different things, okay? So transformation by its very nature, the outcome, the environment ought to be different prior to the implementation of the transformation itself. That is transformation. Any other thing, it's not transformation. So it's a change in form, appearance, nature, or character. It's a complete change. And transformation, as Professor Makgoba would say, that it cannot happen without pain. It's a very painful process that needs to take place for it to happen.
What we're experiencing now is not too surprising, and it's not a sudden explosion of discontent. It's an outcome of policy failure, which is what we've experienced now over the last 2 decades, which is now catching up with us. Now, transformation by its very nature should be radical. We shouldn't have to label it as radical transformation. It should be radical. So you're absolutely right. What we've experienced up to this point has been reformation, very incremental reformation, largely on the back of tweaking of macroeconomic policy. We've had numerous macroeconomic policy frameworks from RDP right the way through to NDP and all the other acronyms in between. But they're all dealing on the absolute surface instead of looking at the structural limitations of what's been inherited in our economy from the pre-1990 state. By the time that the 1990 transition came about, the country was effectively bankrupt. And one of the reasons that we're dealing with, for example, with land, one of the reasons we're dealing now with such a detrimental land infrastructure is because of the settlement of the 1990s and the need, as many, many, many international studies have shown, the only way really to attract investment and international investors over the long term is you've got to guarantee property rights. That's why it's so entrenched in our constitution. It wasn't really necessarily with the view of what eventually would give rise to, which is why we're sitting now with problems with willing buyer, willing seller, land redistribution problems, actual makeup of land ownerships and title deeds, etc., and all the problems that we're dealing with now. At the time when the Constitution was first signed and first actioned and the government in national unity came in, the government inherited a bankrupt country and had to very quickly find ways of stabilizing it, getting access to capital, and get the country moving. After that, unfortunately, we had the RDP come into being, which was overly optimistic about what could be achieved. And much of the frustration we're experiencing now can be related to that frustration that goes back to then, where we haven't delivered on the promises that were envisaged. We haven't delivered on the economy that was supposedly attempting to be built. That doesn't mean, though, that now we are in a position where we can actually even deliver on what we're hoping to deliver, which is the call for radical economic transformation.
That I think the issue has been a lack of commitment at the same time on the part of the private sector to play its part. I'm saying this because I was once a chairperson of the Employment Equity Forum for the Western Cape region, for one of the financial institutions. And what I discovered was that there was no commitment at the time from the managers to actually transform the institutions. Even though you would set targets, there would be no will. I almost said political will. I forgot that I'm talking about the private sector. There'd be no will for them to commit to those targets and make sure that they achieved them, right? I had Dr. Khosa, for example, spoke about the issue around the policy failure. I think in South Africa, in essence, I think we have a general leadership failure, which then contributes to the policy failure that the doctor is talking about. Because if you look at the failure of political leadership and the failure of the private sector and other stakeholders in society, because if one arm of leadership, let me rather put it that way, fails, then there should be others that keeps us in check, others that keep us in check to say you're not doing or playing your part. But we cannot run away from the fact that poverty in South Africa is still largely black, and mainly you find it in townships and villages around the country. And while we have not been able to properly define, the concept, radical economic transformation, but it is indeed needed. But up until we're able to pin it down to say, what do we mean, not as the African National Congress or the United Democratic Movement, what do we mean as a country when we talk about radical economic transformation? Give it pillars and key elements, so that then we can have a blueprint as a country. I think it links up with the points that Doctor talked about.
They talk about something around 14% of a registered state land land being within the state, but there's also about the number that they are punting is 79% being in private hands. And of this, only 79%, of this 79%, it belongs to private individuals, companies, and trusts. That's where the bulk of the land is, or in terms of ownership. And we've been hearing this issue around foreigners cannot own the land. But also the ANC has not been clear in terms of then how do you redress the issues whereby foreigners are already owning the land, what needs to happen. The land issue, it's a ticking time bomb. The land issue is a ticking time bomb. The third issue that we have is the ownership, black ownership in JSE listed companies. Okay, the number that is out there from black professionals themselves, we think is 3%. Okay, and then there's a different methodology that JSE is using. So it says 10% direct ownership, and then it says we own, black people that is, we own 13% indirectly through these other institutions and pension funds and so on and so forth. And so they want us to believe that the black ownership at JSE is 23%. Even if it's 23%, I think it's dismal, compared with the white South African holding of about 22%, and 39% of our JSE top listed companies are owned by foreigners.
You see, if we talk among ourselves as leaders and use your traditional media, but you leave your people behind, you are planting the seeds for a civil war, because no matter how well-intentioned your objectives and your plans are, if the people that you're intending to serve or address, whose challenges you're intending to address, don't know about them, then you're wasting time. Because when you do constituents work and you go back to our people, they are frustrated by what is happening, but they don't know what we're doing as leaders about their challenges, right? Even the minor and the few improvements and the achievements that we've managed to gain so far are not well explained to them to say what was the rationale behind them. So if you don't do that, you tick those boxes, the challenge you are going to have is that then they'll be vulnerable to populists who will use these programs not because they want to transform society, but because they want to gain cheap political mileage and votes at the end of the day. And it is precisely that reason that President Zuma has decided to use radical economic transformation. I'm not too sure if you've noticed, I suppose maybe, Doc, it's a coincidence that you have a Hlaudi now who's pretending to be a champion of transformation at SABC, but when we're looking at SABC during the ad hoc committee on that SABC inquiry, he's completely destroyed that institution. And President Zuma, because he can no longer portray himself as a victim, a political victim.